back to Beating a Dead Horse. As always, I am your host, Sean McKinda.
1, 2, Jackson's coming for you.
3, 4, we watched Nightmare on Elm Street this week and I thought it was okay.
5, 6, didn't commit to the bits.
7, 8, shit, this isn't great.
9, 10, let's never do it again.
Yay! We managed to escape. We did it.
See, that's how you commit to a fucking bit, Nightmare on Elm Street.
I hope that we still have someone listening to the podcast at this point, because I feel like that turned everyone away who thought about, like, oh, hey, they're talking about Nightmare on Elm Street. Let's see what they think about it. And then got into that and went, oh, you know what? Never mind. I don't care what these two chuckle fucks think at all.
Well, I mean, I guess if you are like watching or listening to a podcast about Nightmare on Elm Street apropos of nothing, like it's not like there's a new movie coming out, like this isn't SEO at all, like we just did it because we felt like it. Presumably you are a fan and probably are not so thrilled with our opinions on it, because the first one is still seen as the best one, I think, broadly speaking.
Yeah, don't turn off the podcast yet. We promise we're not going to sit here and just dish on it, being like, well, it's fucking stupid and blah, 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 blah. We're going to kind of examine why it might not have landed for the two of us as a cultural artifact in the year 2021, what we look for in our horror movies, and, you know, like, I'm still going to I have good things to say about it, just not on the whole, unfortunately.
Yeah, I didn't think this was a horrible movie or anything like that, which I suppose as the anti-horror guy on the podcast, you know, people can take how you will. I guess if I were to give like a pithy summary of my opinion, it's that didn't age super well, and not even in like a ooh yikers kind of way, but just in a I'm not super impressed kind of way, you know?
Well, before we really get into our reviews and talk about like our thoughts on it, before diving deeper into the machinations of horror and everything that goes along with that, what is Nightmare on Elm Street? He asks rhetorically, because everyone knows what Nightmare on Elm Street is, but by some chance you don't know what it is. Nightmare on Elm Street is very much like a classic slasher film in which a goofy burned man in a sweater and a hat comes and stabs kids in their dreams. And if you've watched the Rick and Morty episode with Stabby Larry or whatever his name is, where he's like, I'm gonna stab you, bitch, and ends every sentence with bitch, that's Nightmare on Elm Street. Congrats, you're caught up.
It was barely parody. I was surprised to find.
It was barely parody indeed. And I think that's kind of why that bit might land even better now, honestly.
No, for sure. I mean, should we talk about our familiarity with the series? Because I've mentioned before that I've seen one other Nightmare on Elm Street movie when I was 12 and thought it was only okay back then. It was Nightmare on Elm Street 2, which, you know, I now understand there's some discourse about its extremely homoerotic content. Of course, that went completely over my head back then. But, yeah, I mean, I've always been kind of curious about some of these, like, franchise horror stuff. I haven't seen a lot of it, even though I'm not, like, a horror guy. There's something about, you know, as I kind of mentioned in our big disastrous, like, run of kaiju movies, I'm very interested in like symbolism and sort of what kind of characters and ideas we get attached to as a culture. Like, why has Freddy Krueger persisted as a character for as long as he has? Although I guess he had, like, I actually looked it up. The last movie was the remake in 2010, so I guess he kind of hasn't persisted that long now.
Yeah, he's definitely faded away. I don't think after the first one he's really seen a whole lot of success since then. In comparison, my experience with Nightmare on Elm Street is the Rick and Morty episode, honestly. And I mean, beyond that, I would say that it is just the cultural experience of Nightmare on Elm Street. Like, I was intimately familiar with Freddy as a character, mostly through things like Rick and Morty, Robot Chicken, stuff like that. But like, I didn't know a lot about what he was about. I knew that he got caught in a fire thanks to a Robot Chicken one. It wasn't what I thought it was. There was a lot of stuff that this movie caught me off guard with, but it was nothing that caught me off guard. Kind of like when we were talking about Hellraiser, there were things that caught Jackson off guard and they're like, oh shit, this is good type of way. Whereas this, nothing really caught me off guard in that same way. It was more like, oh, that's interesting and not what I was expecting, but like it didn't elevate anything going on with it.
This was kind of my going into Hellraiser, which, you know, I thoroughly enjoyed and was surprised by, as Sean is kind of saying. This is kind of the caliber I was sort of expecting at worst, which isn't to say, again, that I thought the movie was horrible, but it's still a little schlocky. It takes itself seriously, but it's a little too campy in just the wrong places. It's not like full fucking memes, like Freddy Krueger killing a man with the power glove, you know, the NES power glove that you control by waving your hand. He does that in the sixth film, which is, if you look up that clip on YouTube, I mean, Sean put it in the show notes and attached it to the tweet. That scene is really fucking funny, and I recommend everyone watch it. So we haven't gone there yet. We haven't gone like total schlock, but unlike Hellraiser, which still works as a movie and manages to be genuinely unsettling, I think there's just a lot of sloppiness in the film's construction that keep it from that. Like, I don't know if there's anything here that is like inherently bad or unscary, but I think that like the construction of a lot of these scenes, it's sloppy, and I don't want to be too hard on it because it is like a low budget, like basically independent film, and I respect the effort that went into it and how, you know, interesting and fun the concept is. Like, I was making comparisons in my head to like, something like Perfect Blue plays on these same anxieties a lot better, but Perfect Blue came after, and that's, you know, respect to the OG. It's just not an OG that is especially gratifying to go back to.
Yeah, I think that Jackson's really touching on a lot of things that I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about, mostly in regards to why Hellraiser, I think, has lasted across the 40-year span of its release to nowadays, whereas Nightmare on Elm Street struggles a lot more in keeping up the scares. But much like Hellraiser, I do think that there are a lot of really good visuals in some of the deaths, in some of the setups, in some of the even like attempted deaths. I think that there's definitely still some unnerving shots and some really good, clever use of camera and anxiety, but it's just, it undercuts itself so often by being a Looney Tunes movie, honestly. There is just so much to it that feels like I'm waiting for Bugs Bunny to pop out of a bathtub and just go, what's up, Doc? And then hit somebody over the head with a mallet. Because that's kind of the vibe pretty much from the get-go. Hellraiser starts off, and I don't want to just keep comparing it to Hellraiser, but I think it's just particularly salient right now given that we just came off Hellraiser. But Hellraiser opens up with a really strong, spooky scene, and it's very, we've mentioned like it's overblown but understated at the same time. It's gory and gruesome, but it's not splatterpunk in a way that takes away from the horror in it to make it more Evil Dead-esque. Whereas this, the opening scenes with Freddy feels more like a Muppet movie as he stretches his arms really far and basically like Kermit walks down the sidewalk, which was fucking hilarious.
There were a lot of times I laughed out loud. I never laughed out loud at Hellraiser.
Yeah, so it really struggles in that regard, especially because beyond even just having a very Looney Tunes attitude to everything, the script and pacing is kind of all over the place. Like, characters react to one another in just asinine ways. Like, somebody will say something, somebody else will be like, really, you think so? And then, like, they just move past it. It's so weird. No one really, I don't know. The dialogue is just very stilted, and it feels like it's like rushing to get from scene to scene, and like there's parts of dialogue that gets removed for the sake of speeding things along to the next time Freddy shows up. And so those cuts of, I think this is happening. Really? Yes. Okay. Just blast through, and there's no like exploration as to why do you think these are happening. Let's talk about this. How do you feel about it? It's just, no, I think this is okay, cool, let's go do that. And it's kind of weird.
I mean, you can see how easy it was to lean into the schlock angle, right? And like with the sequels, like there's a lot of this that's very silly, and Freddy himself, I think part of this might just be that his reputation sort of precedes him culturally. But again, I don't know. Maybe there's just something in the construction, because that's also true of, you know, if we're comparing it to other like icons of horror, that's also true of like the Alien. But I don't think that the Alien, like watching Alien 1, aside from like the only moment that's comparable, and it's one moment out of otherwise a masterclass like horror movie, is the birthday surprise scene where like the effect of the rubber suit doesn't quite hold up when he goes like, meow. And that's funny, but it's also like a 2-second clip. Nightmare on Elm Street's kind of like if every kill was the birthday surprise scene from Alien. You know, you got Freddy Krueger like yakety saxing down the street, Stretch Armstrong arms for some reason. He doesn't do the quips yet. He doesn't say "now you're playing with power" as he kills someone, which is a real shame because I love that. But like you can see where that goes. Like, I get the angle they're going for, because it's not like, you know, your horror movie monster has to be something completely unknowable like an alien. Like a more human antagonist can work and can be scary. But I was thinking about it.
Definitely what they're going for in this one as well. Just to interject really quick, and we're going to touch on that in a minute. So like before anybody jumps down Jackson's throat for being like, well, obviously they want him to be human. We know, and we're going to talk about it. I promise.
Yeah, for sure. And like that could definitely work. I think in general, like I'm more attracted to the subtly unhuman at least thing. But I think, again, if we're going to compare it to Pinhead, who I think is fair, he's similarly sort of like a not quite man, not quite monster. I think the thing that works about Pinhead, and I think what works about these human antagonists generally, is that if they're like a horror character, there still needs to be that element of unpredictability. Like I was thinking about it, and even for a non-horror example, I mean, I think Heath Ledger's Joker is scarier than Freddy Krueger, despite being like of a similarly iconic status. And like there's even though the Joker is just straight up a guy, there's a palpable tension in those scenes where like you're never quite sure what he's gonna do. Like
no more pencil.
No more pencil. Like sometimes he can be reasoned with, sometimes he can't, and like you're never quite sure. And I think that's what kind of works about Pinhead too. But like here, I don't know if like even at this level, if he just feels too much like a cartoon character. I don't know, but like
there's no rationality to him. Like
no,
he is single-minded. And I mean, as you said, there's a human element to the Joker and to Pinhead that still, like, even in their chaos, you can have a level of pattern recognition and a level of humanity ascribed to them. Whereas Freddy, you never really get that humanity from him, nor do you ever get that full monstrousness from him. You just kind of get a Muppet that chases people around.
And it really doesn't help that like a lot of the staging is super super silly. Like I said, it's like not only like if the birthday surprise shot from Alien keeps happening, it's like if that shot were extended by like minutes instead of seconds.
Pretty much all interior shots when they're in a house and not like in some Silent Hill otherworld stuff going on is pretty good. The kills that take place, or attempted kills that take place within a physical house, are all fairly interestingly shot. They've got stuff going on with them that make them interesting. They're also some of the most iconic scenes in the movie for a reason.
Yep, like the one with the bed, like I knew that shot. The bathtub's a good one.
And the other bed is also pretty good.
Yeah, that's true. And I guess like if I had to describe, like maybe more so than Freddy being goofy, like I think that what was the disappointment for me is that as someone who really enjoyed, something like A Perfect Blue, is that like the movie is clearly aware and wants to play into this angle of like not being able to trust your own senses and that blending of the line between like, dream and reality, and like never being sure if you're safe, if you're asleep or awake, because it all feels real. Like that's something that movies have done a lot and can be done really well still with, solid filmmaking and solid editing, but I just never got that here. Like I always felt like I knew exactly when we were in Freddy mode versus when we were in like 80s comedy mode. Like,
if you want a good example of films that are very gaslighty, Invisible Man does a really good job of it, as does The Lighthouse. Those are really good films that really play with viewers' expectations and keeps you off kilter at all times. It's just in this, it's really easy to tell, like, okay, now we're in the dreamscape within 30 seconds of popping in. There's never that level of off-kilter uncertainty that makes things really good. You never get like the subtle thing of like, oh, that radiator's doing something weird in the background. Maybe we're not in reality anymore. Like it's out of place, but not quite out of place. I can't tell what's up with it. It doesn't even do the It Follows thing where it basically just kind of quietly, subtly tweaks things in the background. Like It Follows basically always try to keep you off kilter through basically never letting you build a sense of time or place in the film at all. Like it would always change the background, weather, the scenery, the timing. Like it would look like it's set in the 60s, but people are using weird Palm Pilot things and people are walking around in shorts even though it's clearly winter, and like all sorts of stuff like that is really good to just leave you a little bit unsettled and off kilter, because setting time is really important in all movies. Honestly, you get that time and place, but if you can't do it, it works well to disquiet you, which is something that this never does. It never tries to do that disquiet where, wait, why are they in shorts and it's outside and snowing? Or I thought it was midsummer yesterday. Why is it now snowing or whatever? There's nothing like that. And that's disappointing for a movie that is so rife with the opportunity to do so in a very organic way.
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear, like thinking about it again. And I understand this impulse, especially if you are like a horror director, that a slasher director in particular, that you're more interested in the kills, like doing creative, interesting looking kills. And in order to make those kills land even better, like you can't skimp on the atmosphere building. Like, it's the neat kill should be the climax to like, some build up. Otherwise, well, you're making Friday the 13th Part 6, where not Friday the 13th Part 6. God, I even keep mixing up the names of these fucking series. Nightmare on Elm Street 6, where he kills him with a power glove, and it's just one going from one set piece to another, which is fine. That can be fun, but like I feel like there's still a way to do this kind of like gory, maybe a little over the top slasher movie without losing that element. Like Hellraiser wasn't really a slasher, but it has those extreme moments, but it doesn't skimp on the build-up.
It's a film that knows how to get that ebb and flow going in a way. And this is a good springing off point for me to talk about why I think that potentially the ebb and flow might have worked in the 80s, but doesn't necessarily work as well for us anymore. And I think that really does come down to the anxieties and fears that we appreciate in horror movies nowadays. Like, just to throw it out there, name a slasher film in the last 5 years. And that's like broad release slasher film. I'm not talking like something on Shudder, which, not to knock anything on Shudder, don't get me wrong, I have no doubt that those are great, but I'm talking like broad release. What's the slasher film that's giving everybody these vibes nowadays? There's a Halloween reboot that's kind of like that, but outside of that, there's not a whole lot happening.
I was about to say, even the franchises, like Halloween's the only one I can think of that has had a recent one. Like,
and even that, I think, is because it's Halloween more than anything. The horror that we see nowadays is more akin to Invisible Man, The Lighthouse, Hereditary, The Witch. I mean, I did 2 Robert Eggers there, but you get what I'm going for.
Even if we're not going so highbrow with like the A24 stuff, I think you're right. And that, like, if we're going to the bottom of the barrel schlock, there's still a palpable difference between the way like the fucking Bye Bye Man operates as opposed to something like a Nightmare on Elm Street.
They're far more. I mean, let's talk about Truth or Dare, a movie I have seen, actually.
I have seen the Bye Bye Man. It is funny.
So we have we know what like the bottom of the barrel schlock horror is looking like right now, and it is far more not cosmic, not existential, but like magical. It's more spooky haunted house stuff, which we're going to talk about a lot more next week when we talk about Insidious, which is just a big spooky haunted house movie from what I remember. This movie might blow my fucking mind next week. We'll find out. But
I feel like Insidious is kind of low key the blueprint for like the average. Not to knock it. I liked it when I saw it back in the day too. But like, I feel like a lot of movies remind me of Insidious these days.
Yeah, no, I think that there's definitely something to that. Like, we're the general audience horror. Again, not to knock it. I'm not looking down on general audience horror. I like horror in general. I have nothing against it, barring Annabelle, I guess. But I also have never seen an Annabelle movie, so who knows? I might fucking love them. I just don't like jump scares, is what it boils down to. But anyway, I digress. The horror that we see in theaters nowadays is far from the slasher horror that we really get. And I think that even the more kind of quote unquote lowbrow general audience stuff is reflective of the more modern anxieties that we have just across the board. It's no longer about slashers. We're not as concerned about serial killers. 1984 was really the prime time for a movie like Nightmare on Elm Street to come out, because the anxiety of, oh my God, we let our kids do whatever the fuck they wanted for the past, 20, 30 years in these cities and just like didn't really check in on them at all, was starting to come to a head. There's people realizing like, oh shit, there were child predators and child murderers out there. Like, I remember hearing my dad talk about how he would just be able to go out and do whatever the fuck he wanted all day. And then like knowing that someone in the neighborhood was keeping an eye on him, that's kind of insidious when you think about it in its own right, because you don't know who is keeping an eye on you at that point. It might be Freddy. And thus we get this anxiety of, oh no, there are people out there who are seeking to hurt our kids, who are seeking to hurt us. This is also where serial killers, not getting a rise, but serial killers were far more prevalent in this time period, which is not something we see as much anymore today. I'll talk about that in a minute. So like the anxiety was far more about one person coming for just a swath of people, like in an individual, like I'm going to kill that person, then I'm going to go kill that person, like across a span of time. That's not as much of an anxiety anymore. I think due in part to the fact that serial killer podcasts are all the fucking rage right now. And I think that the general anxiety about serial killers has gone down as a direct result of that, something that Nightmare on Elm Street was oddly prescient about, which we'll talk a little bit more about in spoilers. But I do think that just like the anxiety of serial killers is way down, especially given that we just don't see serial killers anymore because they've been replaced by lone gunmen and just horrifying mass situations of death rather than like Zodiac style sprees. And I think that these mass situations apply way more to things like cosmic horror. Like that's something that I was thinking about with Color Out of Space, and why Color Out of Space still works really well in this modern era where it's way more loose and interpretive rather than something that is actually fear, because it is more than anything anything, just something that fucking happens to these people. There's no rhyme or reason for it, which is something that we deal with every fucking day that we see a lone gunman or a mass shooter or whatever. There's no rhyme or reason for why it's happening to you. It just, this is the society we live in now, and these are the anxieties we deal with. Meanwhile, we have Hellraiser, which is dealing way more with familial and interpersonal anxieties and fears. Like, that is what that first movie is entirely about. It takes place entirely within a house, a representative of a family. And that's something that we see a shit ton of nowadays. We're looking at, like, again, Lighthouse, Hereditary, Midsommar, all that stuff is far more about the anxiety that comes from familial relations, and Invisible Man especially, talking about like interpersonal relationships in that regard, which is why that holds up still, because that is still and will forever be an anxiety, whereas the anxiety of serial killers has gone way down.
Yeah, I mean, to add on to that point, because I agree with everything that you said. I mean, you know, if in the 80s, if people were afraid about like their children getting abducted, I mean, it's no accident that, you know, Freddy Krueger is specifically like a child murderer implied to be a pedophile. But you know, back then we would have been afraid of Freddy. Now people write fan fiction about Freddy, basically. Like,
yeah.
You know, and I think to add on to that, you know, in terms of like our modern conception, I think to lend credence to what you're saying, sort of the closest thing I can think of to like, you know, the old like franchise, like serial killer, iconic villain driven horror that we have that's still popular, is It. And It, even though it has a lot of the same elements of Nightmare on Elm Street, like, you know, a antagonist that kind of fucks with your head, terrorizes children, blends the line between like dream and reality. And even though that's a movie that, like, you know, we talked a lot of shit on, even It deals more in that realm of like, you know, the terror is the town of living in like an abusive, small-minded environment.
There's a reason that they drop the F slur very quickly in that movie. Like, it is setting a tone, and it hits it hard and fast.
Yeah, so even something like It, like, you know, there's still the boo spooky clown. And I mean, you know, for our own opinions, like, that ended up being the most tiresome stuff for us. So.
I mean, I do even want to, like, extend out that kind of random horror to Annabelle and whatnot, because that doesn't necessarily fit either the familial section or like the cosmic horror of machinations that are beyond our control, be it lone gunman, capitalism, climate change, whatever wild, huge anxiety we want to focus on today. Like Annabelle and the ilk are mostly just scary houses, and those are always scary. I mean, that's just something primal within us. It's far away from, you know, anxiety about slashers. We're all, I mean, I don't know, I would say we're all, but I mean, we've all had those moments of like, oh God, ghosts. Ooh, I don't want to be stabbed by a spooky doll or whatever.
Yeah, because specifically with Annabelle, like, you know, obviously the Annabelle movies themselves are just schlock made because people responded well to a spooky doll. But at least in that first movie, The Conjuring, where Annabelle first appears, that movie kind of has those Hellraiser, like Catholic horror vibes, which fits much more into the trend that you're kind of saying, even though Annabelle does kind of get turned to do a Freddy Krueger because that's all anyone could talk about was the doll scenes from that movie.
Which that is the unfortunate truth of pretty much all horror movies that like take off really well. That's what happened to Hellraiser. We talked about this last week, and that like Pinhead became too big of an icon for the series. Like, they wanted to do other stuff other than Pinhead in that universe. Like, they had plans for other characters to be the big bad, but everyone's like, fucking Pinhead, am I right? And Clive Barker was just like, no, guys, no, don't focus on the other stuff. There's a lot more interesting things happening here. But no, he's got pins in his head.
Or like Halloween 3, like John Carpenter wanted Halloween to be like an anthology series. Halloween 3 has nothing to do with the rest of it, and everyone threw a fit, so they brought Michael Myers back. Like, I
really need to watch Season of the Witch. I've heard good things about it.
I'm curious about it myself for that reason. Like, that's the kind of bold and brash sequel that I can get behind.
And I want to talk about Halloween for a split second here, mostly because I will go off about horror movies clearly until the end of time. You say anything that I could tangentially jump off of, I will do so. The reason I think Halloween works a bit more is just John Carpenter is a fucking master. That just goes without saying. John Carpenter is so goddamn skilled. But like there is a lot more uncertainty built into Halloween and a lot more just sheer terror on just like this unstoppable force that it doesn't seem to have a purpose. And I think that lack of purpose really helps drive home some of the fear that lacks in this movie, because I mean it kind of feels like Freddy doesn't have a purpose, but it also kind of does, and so it just kind of feels goofy. And also Michael, he never looks like a Muppet.
I mean, and I think this movie is at a weird intersection, and that like Halloween's considered like the proto slasher, and I haven't seen that movie, but from what I know, like it is much more about, you know, almost that Hitchcockian like building of suspense, right? As opposed to like if we've got Halloween on one end, then we have like a Friday the 13th, which is basically pornography. Be that literal like sex or like, you know, violence porn. Like you're not watching that movie to get scared. You're watching that movie to watch Jason carve people up. And this movie just it falls into no half measures, Walt. If it's a bit, you must commit. It's neither silly or gratuitous enough to be enjoyable as just sort of slasher pornography, nor does it have that sort of suspense building to really like get under your skin.
And again, I think that comes in part from watching it in 2021. And I do wonder how much anxiety would have stemmed if we had watched this in the era where serial killers and slashers were far more prevalent and anxiety inducing, because Sam will listen to serial killer podcasts 24/7. There are times that like I will be in the other room and I'll just be like, and the man stabbed her so viciously that she was cut in twain and then proceeded to do unspeakable things to her body. And I'm like, Sam, please turn it off. What is wrong with you? Because that is where it gets a little bit weird, honestly. But I mean, like that doesn't faze her at all. And that says a lot about how we perceive serial killers and slashers today.
Yeah. And I think like, to kind of speak to that, I tried to view the movie, you know, try to put myself in the shoes of like, you know, maybe a teenager in the 80s watching this, you know, the kind of people who would have enjoyed it and made it popular. And I could definitely see how it would have worked a lot better, although I do think there are some ways, and I guess I can save this for spoiler discussion. We should
really get into spoilers. We're almost 40 minutes in.
Yeah, holy shit. I don't have too much to say. Mostly there's a scene towards the beginning that I want to talk about that I think the movie kind of shoots itself in the foot with. But like,
Is it Freddy being a Muppet? Because if it's not Freddy being a Muppet, I don't know how much more you could shoot yourself in the fucking foot.
Well, no, it's not Freddy being a Muppet. I think that there's a way that the movie kind of undoes itself a little more subtly, although yes, that is very, very silly.
Let's get into spoilers then. Let's talk about how this movie kind of unravels at its seams. You know, if you want to destroy my sweater, pull this string as I walk away. It's a joke because Freddy wears a sweater, and it's also a Weezer song. It wasn't a good joke. Move on. Spoilers. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review on iTunes. Tell a friend about us. Next week, we're talking about Insidious. So come back for that. We're going to spend some time with James Wan, who is a wild filmmaker. And I'm very curious to see how his stuff holds up.
Hell yeah.
Spoilers?
Spoilers. So I mean, I could just get my little shit about the beginning out of the way, if that's all right, because I don't have much else to say about spoilers.
No, yeah, I mean, I think that our spoiler section is going to, by its nature, be kind of short. I think the conversation that we had to have about this movie is far more in the broad strokes, because
yeah.
I mean, as we said, the problem is there's some script issues with it, there's some pacing issues with it, but like I think the biggest issue is that the anxiety just doesn't translate, despite the fact that there are some good visuals, some interesting kills. It just doesn't land that way. And again, I'm gonna harp on this until the end of time. If your opening shot is Freddy Krueger looking like a fucking Muppet walking down an alleyway, it doesn't work. Imagine if that's how Hellraiser opened. No one would take that movie seriously. Jesus wept, and I'm gonna give you a hug with my big arms.
Jesus wept. Yay!
Talk about the opening. I'm sorry. I keep harping on it, but like I genuinely think it is the most damning thing that the movie does.
So it's not quite the opening. I think where the movie kind of like irreparably damages itself for me, because I was trying to like doing my best to view this through the perspective of like someone who doesn't know all the Freddy gimmicks, right? You know, approaching this movie for the first time, doesn't know the song, doesn't know that he gets you in your dreams, doesn't know, you know, welcome to prime time, bitch, this is the power glove, like all that shit that we know about Freddy, like trying to not see that perspective. And I think my core problem is just that the movie gives up the goods way too early, and I think partially to have a memorable kill that ends up undoing any sort of buildup that the movie could have. And it's specifically the scene where the first girl gets killed, and like he goes sicko mode on her. Like she ends up like flying up upon the walls. The greaser dude she's sleeping with is just watching her like spew blood, like fucking Sanjuro.
I would say big fucking Exorcist, big fucking Train Spotting vibes to it. There's a lot going on in this scene, and yeah, I see where you're going. I'll let you finish, but I have thoughts on that too.
Yeah, so like in my mind, if your central tension is less like Freddy's gonna jump out of the shadow and get me, and more like I can never be quite sure of my perception of reality, like because there is some of that gaslighting, like the adults aren't taking her seriously, but like through seeing such an extravagant kill so directly and having that line between dream and reality be pretty clear, and having the greaser dude watch it go down in real time, like that gives up the goods. I feel like we need the scene where like you can have the buildup, like, you know, sort of hint at Freddy, like you can do the, you know, bait and switch with the main girl and the girl who gets killed first, like have her see some maybe more subtle stuff in her dreams that isn't like a Muppet, and like hint at Freddy and stuff. But then as far as the kill, when we actually get there, we need that ambiguity. We need the possibility that the greaser guy actually did it, which there is no room for, partially because it's so over the top. It's not even just that we see it on camera. It's like, man, like that room, you know, it looks like a deer got like red misted by a semi truck by the end of it. Like
there is, you had to suspend disbelief, but like I can't imagine any cop walking into that room and thinking, "Oh yeah, an 18-year-old boy definitely dragged that girl up to the ceiling to smear her blood up there before dropping her back onto the bed." Like I know that this is kind of harping, kind of nitpicking, but like that was something that like I picked up on immediately that really undermined something what was going on there. Like if that blood was just up there and we hadn't seen it happen, I think it would have worked a lot better, like just to Jackson's credit. But like, yeah, it's right off the bat, I'm like, okay, so he's got wild cosmic powers, and I mean, immediately after that, the greaser's death was subtle enough that like it could have worked. Like that, the greaser's death would have been a good, logical increase in tension. There's a word I am looking for that I cannot find, to, you know, go from a subtle, did he do it, did he not, death to, oh, there's definitely something going on here, to, oh shit, there's something going on here when the boy gets sucked into the bed, to an end payoff.
I guess it feels like the movie kind of wants to have its cake and eat it too, as far as the central tension. And I think the difference is, I think the movie doesn't know whether the horror is like, you know, this unprovable magical thing that like where nobody believes you, right? Like that gaslighting thing that we've talked about, or whether the tension is like Freddy can get you in your sleep. Like, you are vulnerable in your sleep, and sleep is something that you have to do. Like, there's no avoiding him. And I think that those two tensions are kind of at odds with each other.
For sure. No, I 100% agree with you on that one.
Yeah, and like, there's just a lot of, I don't want to harp on it too much because I know that you have stuff you want to talk about with the ending, but I think that maybe that's that it never reconciles that central tension, and like the escalation, it's too much too soon for it to like really like gnaw at you.
Yeah, and to give credence to Jackson's talking about how, we never have to wonder whether we're in the dream state or not. I mean, the first time that like there is that potential for tension of like, are we in the Silent Hill Otherworld is a really good comparison to it. Is when our main character falls asleep in class, and then she like looks over and fucking Sarah Palmer ass dead girl is standing in the hallway, and you're like, okay, well, this is clearly a dream. Like, that's not real in any way, shape, or form. Why would I think that it is? What's the spookiness here? Like, there's no build up to that. That's where there should have been like a couple of moments where it just kind of kept operating in a dreamlike state where you're not sure whether it's dream or not. Because like the guy reading the book changed what he was reading to a little bit more biblical hymns, and nothing really came from that. Also, there's a lot of like religious imagery in this movie that I feel like they just like drop halfway through, and I thought it was going to be something so much more interesting than it was.
I forgot about that, but you're right.
There was a lot of like crucifixes, especially because like it's literally like what 1, 2 Freddy's coming for you, 3, 4 lock the door, 5, 6 grab your crucifix. Like, I'm like, okay, There has to be something with crucifixes, and like I was again religious horror. I'm on board. Let's fucking go, baby. And then it really just drops so fast. And I thought that would have been interesting, especially because like the opening scene with him pushing the crucifix off the wall was like, oh, okay, cool. So he can't get through where there's a crucifix, but if it's up there, he had to knock it off to do that. No, it doesn't matter. Whatever.
Because then he stretches through the wall like Taffy.
Which, okay, admittedly, when you describe it like that, funny, but I think that it actually has some potential to be a really clever scene. Like, I think like when it first happened, that would have been rad as hell. I knew what that scene was, so it didn't do much for me.
Yeah.
But like, I think going into the theater blind, that would have been like an oh shit, what type of moment.
Yeah, and there to the movie's credit, there is some subtle stuff. Like, I do like how I mentioned the hand in the bathtub earlier, and like that's a nice tense shot of like, she's still asleep. And we don't get the literal, like, she wakes up and the hand disappears and the mom calls. Like, I like that nice visualization of like he's creeping up and he's like about to get her. And then the mom calls and his hand like whoop, like ducks back in. But and like that like we've woken up. Like that feels a little different. That feels like maybe we are blurring the line a little bit between dream and reality, but there's just not enough of that work done in the movie otherwise.
That bathtub scene too, when she gets pulled under the water, is a really, really potent visual metaphor for just sleep in general.
Yes.
Like, that is so fucking powerful as an image, but again, it's just bookend by nonsense.
No, and I guess, like, like, I hadn't thought about it in these terms, but I suppose I am really disappointed because I mentioned one of the reasons that Perfect Blue resonated with me is that I am interested in, like, dreams and nightmares, and will often have these, like, esoteric Lovecraftian nightmares that haunt my every moment. Like, when I was a child, I had kind of that Freddy Krueger feeling that I would have recurring nightmares with like recurring villains, and I wouldn't want to go to sleep because I wouldn't want to, be there, but I had to. And I think that the movie, that it doesn't, aside from that bathtub scene, aside from that, never really plays with that idea because it just doesn't know whether it wants to go for the inescapable angle or like the gaslighting angle, and it never finds a way to reconcile those things.
I mean, the back half of it is far more about the inescapability of sleep, and the front half is way more about the gaslighting angle. But like, the problem is that the other half of it is it's got kind of like a yin and yang thing going on, and that you can see parts of each other in both of those scenes. And I think that having that part in it weakens it in some regard because it's kind of like too busy thinking about how it interacts with each other rather than focusing on making that one part of the film very tense. And I don't think that there is necessarily an inherent push and pull between those two ideas. I think that you can have gaslighting in the first half and the inescapability of sleep in the back half. Like, that's a really great idea. But when you give up the ghost for the inescapability of sleep in the first half, when you're trying to do gaslighting, and you kind of give up gaslighting for the inescapability of sleep in the back half, it weakens both is the problem.
Yeah, 100%. Completely agreed.
So all I really have to say about the ending, though, is just that it's just a fucking Looney Tunes, y'all. It goes full Looney Tunes. It goes full Looney Tunes. It goes full fucking Home Alone. She sets up like a shit ton of traps in her house. At one point, like, he opens the door and a sledgehammer hits him in the gut. What?
She like wrestles with him on the ground.
Yeah, him falling down the steps was the best goddamn part. Oh my god.
It keeps happening. I warned you, bro. I told you about stairs.
Oh my god, that ending. Okay, stairs in general. I want to talk about stairs for a second because there's a lot of stairs are a very recurring thing in this movie, and clearly there's designed to be some anxiety around stairs. I think that's an interesting idea. But the one stair set that she goes up where there's just clearly goo holes in the stairs is I don't get what was going on. Okay, so like if we want to look at it from a thematic like reading on it, like, you know, the anxiety of going upstairs to see what happened, yeah, there's something there. But like a literal Stay Puft Marshmallow Man in the stairs is kind of goofy, and I do wonder if it is the problem that I watched it on a 4K TV, so I could clearly differentiate between you're about to step in goo and that's a stair, but it's still kind of goofy.
All right, boys, I'm about to make a JoJo comparison. You ready?
It's been a couple episodes. You know what? I think that's what I like about horror movies, is that it's way harder for you to make JoJo references.
This was relevant, though, and I think it's a good contrast, and maybe one of the ways that, you know, the movie kind of wants to have its cake and eat it, or like opts to go for like the flashier like goop effect when maybe like a subtler editing trick would have conveyed the fear more appropriately. Because like when you think about the stairs, you can have this idea that works really well with the like inescapable, like we're descending or we're trying to ascend and escape and we can't. Like, I'm assuming that's the idea behind the sticky stuff, is that, like, you know, you're trying to go upstairs to escape and, like, it's holding you back, like, you can't. But, you know, when I think of, like, running up a staircase trying to escape and not being able to do it, I think what's more effective is something like the Mario 64.
I was just going to say Mario 64.
Yep. And that's not in, like, a horror context. But where JoJo comes in is that, like, you know, that moment where Dio's like, all right, Polnareff, like, you know, you can join me. Or, like, you know, you could come up these stairs and get fucked. And then he starts fucking with him, like, stopping time and, like, you know, using his stand to push him back. Which, if you stop and think about it, is a funny image of Dio using the world to, like, stop time, literally lift Polnareff up and put him at the bottom of the stairs and he doesn't know what's going on. Like, I've seen, like, GIFs and stuff. It's very funny. But it's not funny in the moment because they do that. They don't do the, like, you know, extended, like, Zawarudo, like, you know, the effect. They just do some editing tricks. Just, like, you know, cut back. Polnareff takes a step, cut to him at the bottom of the stairs, and him, like, realizing, like, wait, like, Dio hasn't moved. I haven't moved. What the fuck is going on? And I feel like those sort of editing tricks to, like, do something like a Polnareff Dio moment or, like, an endless staircase, you can convey that same idea without doing Stay Puft Marshmallow Man goop. But I think part of what, you know, Wes Craven and like the other people involved in the film wanted to do, which I mean I can respect, is to have like fun, goofy slasher horror stuff, but it just doesn't work for creating dread because it's goop.
Mm-hmm. No, for sure. On the flip side, though, the flaming footsteps were rad as hell, and I do have to give them credit where credit is due.
I mean, it's not like this movie is completely without merit or anything like that. It's just,
I hope that we have made that abundantly clear at this point. Like, we have been kind of dishing on it, but it is mostly from a place of like, you're so close, movie. You're so close to something great, and we want to explore why.
Yeah, and again, I'm willing to give the movie a lot of rope, is that, again, I can compare it to Perfect Blue, which does the, like, inescapable nightmare world thing a lot better. But Perfect Blue was also made, like, I mean, that was the 90s, I think, probably like 10 years after this. So it's not entirely fair.
No, I think that this is a movie that we do have to give credit to for being a progenitor of a lot of ideas, including Rick and Morty. So, hey, thanks for that, he says facetiously, because, oh my God, Rick and Morty.
Rick and Morty is a good TV show. I will defend that take.
I will not argue with you. I enjoy Rick and Morty, but also fuck Rick and Morty.
I mean, it's very easy for me to say that because I did not work at McDonald's when, like, you know, the Rick and Morty fans did the equivalent of storming the Capitol over Szechuan sauce.
I do want to talk about one last thing before we wrap up here.
Absolutely.
And that is the end. And I want to get your take on it, because I have not even asked you how you thought about the very end of this movie.
Oh, right. Yeah, I forgot. All right. So you want my take first?
Yeah, go for it. Why not?
I think I see what they're going for, but it feels pretty nonsensical. Maybe it's just the silliness of, like, the Freddy car. Like, it's kind of like if, I mean, even at this point, Freddy's too iconic for his own good. He's got, like, a color palette. It's like if they had, like, the Mario overalls on the car and Mario was the villain, you know?
Oh,
like,
God, Cappy, what did you do?
No, exactly. Yeah, I thought the ending was... It felt like it was trying to make up for the fact that the movie didn't do a very good job of playing with the boundaries of reality. It felt like we were playing catch up to me.
So I'm going to take a quick step back and just kind of explore what's happening here and why I think the movie was prescient for a moment and then did something weird and I would argue dumb. In that, so the movie ends, the main character defeats Freddy by basically turning her back on him and not giving him power, which is something that I mentioned is something that we are doing nowadays. Like, serial killers just don't really exist anymore because we don't give them power. They don't see TV play. They're not as interesting because everyone knows about serial killers. No one is afraid of serial killers anymore. Like, not on the, like, we're afraid on a personal level. Like, I hope I don't get stabbed type of level, but like not in the zeitgeist as it once was. So I think that the movie was kind of right in that, like, we don't give them power. They don't have that power over us for sure. But then they're in heaven, I guess. Like, it's definitely like some sort of heaven or hell allegory thing going on here. But I don't see what they were going for with it outside of, isn't this a twist?
Well, that is actually what, like, if you get to what actually happens, it feels like at the end of Troll 2, where the goblins all of a sudden like nonsensically come back and say and like eat his mom, even though they all got blowed up. So like the fact that I can make Troll 2 comparisons is never a good sign for your serious horror movie. But like when I say, like, I see what they're going for, and that, like, you know, having one last stinger, like kind of like the Inception top, like one last sort of like questioning of whether we really got him.
You get what they were going for from a story standpoint,
yes.
Not as much. I was thought you meant more from like a thematic standpoint. Like what was everything going on with that? Like, how does that tie the story nicely together? Because it clearly does not.
No, it was very clearly like put in. I feel like a lot of slasher movies do this, where it's just like, oh, we got him, except, haha, not really. I mean, fuck, even Troll 2 does it. And in practice, that's how this plays out.
I mean, even Hellraiser is kind of guilty of it in its own weird way. That kind of felt like it was more setting up an anthology rather than like a direct sequel. But this one definitely feels it's like, well, here's the sequel. Let's go, Freddy Car.
Yeah. Well, and with Hellraiser, I guess spoilers for that too. Like when that last shot of like, you know, what's your pleasure, sir? Like, you know, like bringing the box. Like there is at least some thematic resonance to that, and that, like, you know, the cycle keeps repeating because, like, it's in the nature of people to like fly too close to the sun and like desire what they shouldn't. Like there's something to that. This is nonsense.
And if you're worried that we just spoiled something about Hellraiser, that is such a non-spoiler. Don't worry too much about it.
Yeah.
If you were thinking about watching Hellraiser, here's I'm gonna sneak this in. Watch Hellraiser. It's a fan-fucking-tastic movie. It's so good.
Yes, holds up much 1,000 times better than this does.
So I guess final question.
All right, lay it on me.
Would you recommend Nightmare on Elm Street today?
Ooh, probably no. I guess like if you are if you're the main character of Ready Player One and you just really like the 80s, maybe I would, because it's got enough of that 80s cornball vibe. I mean, otherwise, there's not really that much of a reason to go back to it.
I will echo that, except my caveat's going to be if you're someone who's interested in horror and just wants to watch some of the classics, I think that's a good reason to go back and watch it. There's definitely some stuff to it that is interesting from a horror standpoint, especially like my interpretation of like why it doesn't hold up anymore. Like that's something that you're interested in. It's good for that. But yeah, I think on the whole, if you have not seen it before and you're looking to watch something new, I don't know that it's going to do that much for you in 2021. But we could be wrong.
Yeah, I'll second what you said about like being interested in horror. As someone who's, I mean, not horror so much specifically, but as far as like, iconography and symbolism and like, what we attach to culturally. I mean, I think we had a good discussion, and in that regard, I don't regret watching it.
No, I don't either. I don't think that this was a bad thing to watch at all. I do not regret it. There was never a moment where I'm like, oh fuck, this is a terrible. It is no King Kong 1933, shall we say?
I was a little worried on stream the other day when you came to me and was like, Jackson, have you watched Nightmare on Elm Street yet? Horror is bad, actually. I was worried we were in for another King Kong scenario. Like there would have been extended scenes of Freddy like violating people or something like that. Like,
no, I would have texted you about that one. That's one that I feel like would have required an actual warning before going into. Although technically, I mean, if you get right down to it, horror, like the knives are always a very phallic symbol in horror, and like that type of stabbing is very much representative of the penetration. And this is where I get way too into the fact that I've been reading a lot of like scholarly things about horror recently, so I'm going to stop right now before we dive into a full another hour conversation about male gaze and male assertion through sexual violence in horror, because I can talk about that too.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the knives as one final meme, because I didn't realize, like, I always figured the knives were just something Freddy had in like the dream world to like show that, ooh, like we're menacing, like this is something I constructed as a dream reality. I laughed out loud the hardest when the mom pulled out Freddy's glove that he made.
Oh my
in the
god!
real world.
The fact that the movie thought that we needed to see him build it is so fucking wild.
It's like he couldn't have just been like a child murderer who like, did his child murdering normally and like up the ante after he became like a dream demon or whatever. Nah, he needed to have his stupid glove.
He could have had his stupid glove even doing that. Like there could have been like, yeah, he wore, like if his mom pulled it out, like I think that would have still been kind of off kilter and weird. But I think the problem is that we saw him build it. Like that's so insane. Like they're like, this is going to be the most iconic thing to ever grace horror from the get-go. It's like if we saw Pinhead's origin before Hellraiser started. Like, we know that it is going to be the next big thing. It's so wild. It's so wild.
I mean, they were on the money. It is one of the most iconic things in horror, to be fair.
But not because we saw him build it.
No.
I didn't know that was a thing. Neither of us knew that was a thing. That says everything right there.
I'll tell you what, it has strong Pokemon the first movie energy, that they called it Pokemon the first movie.
He's accidentally right is what you're getting at there.
Well, in this case, it's accidentally right. I think they they were very much intentionally right with Pokemon the first movie.
Fair. Calling their shots and getting it very right.
Yeah. Although I guess with Pokemon, it wasn't as safe a bet because people were theorizing the whole time that the fad was going to die out, and it just never did.
Yeah, I was going to say there was a lot of expectation that bubble was going to burst in the 90s. Anyway, we're not talking about Pokemon. I've been Sean McKenna. You can find me on Twitter at Sean_McKenna, where I will probably be tweeting about horror because I'm a psychopath.
I've been Jackson Keller. If you do want to hear me talk about Pokemon, you can go to twitch.tv/JacksonJKeller. I talk about Pokemon all the fucking time because I'm a loser.
You want to mention your Twitter?
Oh, yeah, Twitter, Jackson J. Keller. Fuck Twitter.
I mean, retweet. And also, fuck Twitter. Follow us on Twitter at BADH_cast. We have a Patreon, patreon.com/BADHcast. It is paused. I paused it before we started recording for the next month, so you will not accidentally be charged. Oopsie doopsie. So I don't know what you can do over there, but if you want to go check it out, you can. Go for it. Knock yourselves out. Thanks as always to the High With You for our theme song. It is Suicide Alter, take off the album High Octane, Low Expectations. They're a wonderful band. You should go check them out however you can. Buy their music, stream their music, support them on Bandcamp. Whatever you got to do, do it. Also, links to 25yearslatersite.com. There's a little button up in the corner that you can click on, but you should absolutely see what they're talking about over there. There's a bunch of really talented people doing a bunch of really talented writing that you should absolutely read. Next week, as I said, we're going to be talking about Insidious, a movie that Jackson and I have both seen, have both liked, but we're both young and stupid when we watched it.
Darth Maul is in this movie, and in hindsight, it is silly, but I still enjoy that movie.
Bye!
Don't you go into the ground. Don't you go